Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot to discuss in this video topic. We are going to talk about the top 10 mistakes in Active Directory and how to remediate. It's going to be jam-packed. And at the end, we'll give you some tips and some recommendations on how to research or find some resolutions. Throughout these 28 years, I've worked both as a direct hire for companies and agencies, as well as a consultant through much or most of that career. As a Microsoft specialist, I've obtained many certifications from the beginning point all the way up to this point in my career. I've seen some common mistakes made over and over again, and I've created a list of the top 10 ones that I think are very important to understand and to be aware of and to avoid. I do freely admit that in the beginning of my journey, when I was still learning, I've made some of these same common mistakes myself, but I learned from them and I avoided them in the future. So let's jump right into the list. Number 10. The deployment of other rules and services on domain controllers. And the reason that this is a problem is because when you install other rules and services on domain controllers, you impose certain security risks on AD from those other services for the requirements they have on communications and permissions. You expose that domain controller in Active Directory to risks that Active Directory would not normally be subject to. You also have potentially imposed possible conflicts with AD. Also, if a domain controller goes down, so do all the other services on that domain controller. And also, if a DC needs to be upgraded or replaced, and when we say DC, we're talking about domain controllers, typically a migration of all the other services or roles that are installed in the domain controller also are required to be upgraded or migrated. Some of the other roles and services commonly co-located and found on DCs, unintentionally installed and unaware that they could cause issues are, that I've found in the past, Active Directory Certificate Services, ADCS. Now this one is a real trouble to migrate. You can't just upgrade a DC in place with this or migrate it. You have to migrate the services. Azure Connect or Entra Connect. File and print services. And when I say file services, we're actually having file shares and users storing files on a domain controller, DC. And Network Policy Server, NPS, or Radius. Number 9, having a single domain controller. And this is extremely risky, and I see it a lot in small businesses. Often they don't understand the risk, and often the small businesses also have their file server on a DC because they're just putting everything on a single server. And the biggest risk is there is no replication or high availability. If that single domain controller DC goes down, you have a complete production downtime during disaster recovery. Workstations can't communicate, you can't get to the services, you can't authenticate, all those kind of things. And hopefully that machine or virtual machine was backed up either with the system state or the whole virtual machine itself, so you can recover. If not, you're looking at a complete Active Directory rebuild in potentially a rebuild of the entire file system with the shares and all that kind of stuff by attempting to recover those shared data from the hard drive. So really bad. And that's also rejoining all the machines to the new domain if the worst disaster scenario happens, where you have to rebuild AD altogether. Which brings us to number 8, domain controller backups. At the bare minimal, you should have system state backups for each domain controller. Alternatively, you could have virtual machine backups. Now, these backups should happen on a daily basis or several times per day, according to your organization requirements. But what we find is there's no system state backups. And the system state backups would have the AD database, NTDS, the sysvol, the registry, the boot files, etc., or the virtual machine backup. The second part to the backups is just setting them and letting them go is not okay. Assuming that they're working and then getting into a disaster scenario and trying to recover only to find out that there's no recent backup of the domain controller or any domain controller, that's not going to help you out at all. You're going to be reverting to, hopefully, a backup that hasn't been deleted from your backup cycle, and you have nothing to recover from. So you have to make sure that your backups are monitored and tested regularly. So on virtual machines, you can restore a virtual machine and just not boot it up to the network and just make sure it works okay, and that's fine. If you're just doing system state backups, and you can have a dev environment and restore the system state to the dev environment. So it's very important to make sure that you're monitoring the backups to make sure they were completely successful, and also, regularly testing them to make sure that you can restore them as well. Number 7, domain controller replication. What I see commonly is incorrect AD sites setup. You haven't set up your sites to reflect either your physical layout or your logical layout for Active Directory, and you've manually configured replication links and they don't work correctly or inefficiently, and your subnets are not defined in your AD sites, which again leads to incorrect configuration and inefficiency with things such as workstation communication and all that kind of stuff. Best practice is to leave the replication links at their default when you install domain controllers in Active Directory, unless there's a specific design and architectural requirement to change those replication links. For instance, you have an off-site Active Directory site that you want to replicate to as a backup, and it doesn't replicate except for every 24 hours for disaster recovery purposes. So in that case, it may be acceptable, but it takes a lot of design requirements and has to be reviewed. And what I also see is that administrators don't regularly check their event logs on domain controllers to see if there are replication problems, or go to a domain controller in a domain in the forest, any domain in the forest, and make sure that you're testing replication to make sure that replication is happening between all domain controllers. Number 6 is the file system replication, the underlying component for domain controllers for replicating their databases and group policy objects and sysfile and all that kind of stuff. If you are in an environment where you came from really old domain controllers, let's say it's 2003, that would have used FRS instead of DFSR. And if you upgraded regularly, you might not have ever changed the file system from FRS to DFSR as far as the replication for the domain controllers. So you want to make sure that at one point it had been upgraded, DFSR has a lot of advantages and it's more efficient. So I see that all the time where it was never upgraded because you inherited a domain, a forest and domain that just had never been upgraded for the longest time. Number 5, and this is a big one and very, very common. Organizational unit OU structure and hierarchy. Lots of different issues I see all this time in my consulting experience. Not following best practices. There's an illogical design. The OUs do not align with or meet the organizational department structure. It doesn't serve group policy management deployment effectively or efficiently. It doesn't allow for delegation of permissions appropriately. And this is very important. We'll talk about that a little bit with group policy objects and permissions and designing your OU structure to allow the different administrators in your organization with role-based access control to allow to set permissions only on the objects that they need permissions to. So your organizational unit structure has to accommodate that. Going hand in hand with number 5, organizational units, is number 4, group policy objects, GPO. What I see too often are too many GPOs, poorly constructed GPOs, conflicts, they're not applying appropriately, there's permission issues, and they're difficult to administer and maintain. Basically, they just threw up any GPO for anything they needed at any point, and they didn't consider combining GPOs appropriately, linking those GPOs, considering inheritance and override and all those kind of things. And number 3, legacy domain. I see this very often, all the time. What happens is there will be legacy domain controllers. Their operating system is outdated and or unsupported. And they have a legacy domain and forest functional levels. And some of the problems with this are that eventually the domain controller operating system, when it becomes out of support, you will never get the critical and security updates and they will be vulnerable. And additionally, if you don't upgrade the domain and forest functional levels, you won't get benefit of the new features that you'll see from the newer operating systems when you upgrade. So when you have the availability to upgrade your domain to the new domain and forest functional levels, you should, as a part of a project plan, to get the benefit of the new features and security measures. Number 2, administrator roles and permissions. The thing to keep in mind here is best practice with the least permissions model for RBAC, role-based access control. You want to have your administrators in the role group that gives them the least amount of permissions to perform the duties that they need to do for day-to-day stuff, and not give them any elevated permissions to do anything that they shouldn't be able to do outside of that. And this is very often a huge mess, and it's not always to blame on the people that are currently running the environment. Very often it's inherited, and you've got administrators that just were cowboys, and they decided to do whatever they needed to do to get stuff done without considering or planning appropriately. And so what we typically see in most or many Active Directory environments are that these administrators used manual assignment of permissions all over the place, and there's no tracking of who got what permissions, and it's almost a nightmare. It is a nightmare to try to track that or redo it or remediate. The overuse of built-in roles, for example, domain admins, like everybody was just given the domain admins permissions to make it easy. And then, with those permissions, that role group, you find low-level admins making mistakes that cause serious problems in the environment that they shouldn't be able to do because they shouldn't have that permission to begin with that inside of that role group. The practice of not using the delegation of permissions wizard, which is the best practice way to do stuff. And inside of that delegation of permissions wizard, not using groups, using individual users. What you should do is actually, with the delegation of permissions wizard, have very specific groups for the very specific rules that need to be accomplished and put users into that group for each type of rule that needs to be assigned, and use the delegation of permissions wizard on each OU. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And number 1, this is a non-technical, but a management and administrative thing. Number 1, poor management, poor oversight, poor decision-making. This is probably the root cause of a lot of the other technical issues. And I see this in almost every environment at some point. And there are a lot of things that go into this. You'll see no change management system in place. Every organization should have a change management system. A change management system dictates, okay, we want to make a production change. We have to have a system of decision-making and planning and back out, and it's all recorded, and there's a team that's dedicated to that, to discuss it and plan it and schedule it, all that kind of stuff. Every organization should have a change management system, and if you're using vendors for projects, you should include those vendors in the change management decision-making process. Administrators performing projects and or duties, tasks outside of their scope of knowledge and experience. And I do see this, unfortunately, a lot of times in the education realm, especially when an organization cannot afford to hire, I hate to say it, but it's true, somebody who is experienced and knowledgeable to perform the duties that the role that they're filling requires. Which leads us to not knowing your limits as an administrator. Don't give God permissions to everybody or a single user in your environment, and thus they're really, really capable and experienced, and they're the type of person that is going to do the research and plan and discuss with the team and have a backup plan and all that kind of stuff to prevent as best as possible any disasters or downtime. Also, as a manager, you should plan on regular skills development training. I've seen very often where there's no regular skills development training. I mean, technology constantly changes, and we have to keep up as IT pros, and that's a huge risk to your environment if you don't plan that in to their tasks. And organizations should really consider using specialists who work with the technology, specialized technology, day in and day out, and they know it better than a generalist inside of your organization. So what I see all the time is not using a contractor specialist when necessary. Nobody's going to know that technology better than somebody who specializes in it and does it day in and day out, and knows the gotchas, have seen disasters, and know how to recover from them. So you really need to use contractor specialists when necessary. And the next one is very annoying to me. You know, a lot of times management gets hired out of a technical role and they still want to be technical, but they don't have the time to maintain the technical skills. So what I see is management making technical decisions and not trusting their experienced staff and their experienced contractors. At a certain point, they have to be peripheral and be in the know on a higher level knowledge, but they don't need to make the granular day-to-day decisions technically. They need to trust their experienced staff and contractors when they get in and try to do the stuff themselves and make be micromanagers and do that. Usually it ends in disaster. The next one is a really tough call, and it's an argument that has to be taken up because it's in the best interest of the organization. Letting budgets dictate technology and projects. Management has to be well-informed and assertive with the upper management and executives. They have to research, they have to rely on the specialists, the contractors, and their own internal team, and they have to reach out to those specialists when they are making decisions that impact the organization and productivity. And remember, in the end, poor decisions lead to increased production downtime, disasters, and ultimately lead to increased expenditure. So although you may think that doing this yourself is going to save money, what I've seen is it almost always leads to making more money, leads to spending more money that's not in the budget than if you would have actually had the project outsourced, because the contractors actually have to go in and undo what you did incorrectly and redo it correctly. So I hope this section on the common mistakes was helpful. Let's not leave it there. Let's go on to the next section, which is, okay, we've got a mess. We're not going to have, a step-by-step for my specific scenario in a YouTube video, but we can at least look at some general guidelines, some tips, some suggestions, and some advice. So let's go there. So now we will go through each one of the top 10 mistakes in Active Directory, and we'll give some tips and recommendations on each, possible resolutions. Starting with number 10, deployment of other roles and services on domain controllers. There really is no other solution than to migrate those roles and services off of the domain controller onto another server or servers. Application servers, file servers, print servers, have dedicated servers for those. I've provided a list below of all the common services or roles that are co-located on a domain controller and the hyperlinks for each on how to migrate them off. So Certificate Authority, Entra Connect, or Azure Connect as it used to be known, Azure AD Connect, file services, print services, and network policy services, NPS, which is also in conjunction with Radius. Number 9, a single domain controller, DC. There's only one path to follow for this. You have to install at least one additional domain controller, recommended 2, in the same domain, same forest, ideally on the same network segment, same LAN, but could be in another network segment as long as it can traverse the firewall and communicate with that other LAN. Best practice dictates that you should have one physical domain controller and at least one physical domain controller, and the rest could be virtual. Number 8, domain controller backups. Now, your procedure on this is going to depend on your infrastructure, whether you have physical domain controllers or virtual domain controllers. And whether you're using a third-party system for backups, such as Dell and their Power Edge series, Power Store, I should say, like Avamar, or whether you're relying on just the Windows native backup, which is the Windows Server backup. If you're backing up the entire virtual machine, then you probably do not have to back up the system state. If you are not doing a bare metal backup and restore procedure for emergency purposes, then you'll want to use a software that's going to do the system state backup. And so we've included the Windows Server backup hyperlink below, so that you can learn from that and on how to back up and restore. It's important that you check on a daily basis, at least a daily basis, that the backups are successful. Monitor those backups, and that you test restores on a regular basis as well. If it's a virtual machine, you can restore the virtual machine offline and just check and make sure that the restore works, so that you do it offline so that you don't interfere with a production or with an outdated version of that domain controller. If you're doing the system state, you could have a dev environment or a test machine that's offline and restore the system state to that dev environment machine, virtual machine, or physical machine, whatever. You just don't want to be caught in a disaster situation and find out, oh, my backups weren't working or they're not restoring properly. Number 7, domain controller replication. The best thing you can do is to monitor the domain controller event logs for warnings and errors. And the location for that is shown below. You go to the application and services logs directory service, and you're looking for any warnings or errors in there. You can offload those to a SIEM. You can have alerts, and probably have your NOC, if you have a dedicated NOC, monitor those on a regular basis, or somebody needs to monitor those. Number 6, file system replication. And remember, we're talking about Active Directory file system replication, the Active Directory database, NTDS, sysfile, those kind of things, group policy, structure and files, all that kind of stuff. First thing you want to do is check out the current state on a domain controller via PowerShell with the command shown below. And it'll tell you if you're currently at upgraded to DFSR or still at FRS. And if you're at FRS, I've included the hyperlink on the quick start to upgrade to DFSR. Number 5, organizational unit OU structure and hierarchy. Unfortunately, there's not a quick fix, one size fits all solution for this. It really requires meeting with all the stakeholders on your team to discuss the pain points and plan a new design. And again, you probably want to pull in some consultants to discuss a redesign of your OU structure according to your organizational needs. My general advice is to spin up a dev environment to test your new design before making any changes in your production environment. And when you go to your production environment, what you'll want to do is spin up the new OU structure atop your existing structure and slowly roll out test devices and test users and test groups and test GPOs and all that kind of stuff, and slowly roll in maybe one organizational unit at a time, and troubleshoot along the way and make a slow migration path towards changing your old structure into your new structure. And eventually, when everything works well, and you've migrated, moved all those objects into the new OUs and all your group policies, linked them to the new one, then you can get rid of the old organizational units. And again, that ties into number 4, group policy objects with the OU redesign. Something we did not discuss before as far as a particular in the mistakes, the common mistakes in Active Directory, but it is kind of a subcategory on that. The lack of a central store for group policy objects. But it does create problems with group policy replication. If you don't have a central store, you don't have replication between domain controllers, and that's why you might see inconsistency and problems with group policy processing and inconsistency, basically. So check out my YouTube video on this. I have a whole separate YouTube video on this, on how to create a central store. Really easy stuff, straightforward, but I've got a step-by-step video on that. If you want to find conflicts, there's a really great tool that comes as part of a larger tool set that Microsoft offers called the Group Policy Analyzer. And I've provided the hyperlink below. And it's a little confusing to run the first time, but once you've run through it, it's an excellent tool. You can export and select your group policies and compare them for conflicts and settings. So I highly recommend that tool. I've used it dozens of times in the past when I do Active Directory assessments and ultimately remediations to find where there's conflicts. Also, remember to check the security filtering on GPOs. Often, if the GPO is not getting applied, then maybe you don't have the security filtering set up correctly towards the right groups. Which brings us to our last tip, some of the tools you can use to assess group policy. The first two are command line tools. You can run them from any endpoint device. GP result /R, which will tell you all the group policy objects that are applied to that machine and that user that's logged in that you're running that command line as. And then RSOP, which will give you a graphical user interface, which is a little more user-friendly, that shows a lot of the same stuff, but it'll additionally also show you any warnings or errors in that GUI. And then from the Group Policy Management Console on a domain controller, you can always run the Group Policy Modeling Wizard, and you can run it for any machine or any user. So you can simulate what group policy is going to look like. So those are all great tools to troubleshoot group policy. And then number 3, legacy domain. We don't want to keep it old school technology that's unsupported anymore. So you want to perform a domain upgrade. And then once the domain upgrade is in place, you want to perform a domain enforce functional level upgrade to get the benefits of all the new features and security enhancements. A couple notes on the domain upgrade. I always recommend installing new domain controllers with the newest operating system when you're doing this and aiming for instance, a domain enforce functional level of Windows Server 2025 because it's cleaner. I do not recommend, unless it's absolutely necessary, to do an in-place upgrade of the operating system for a domain controller. However, when you go to demote the old domain controller, the legacy domain controller, you might have DNS entries that point to that legacy domain controller that you're going to have to consider. There might be application servers, web servers, client computers, print servers that are pointing to that, third-party systems, all that kind of stuff. You might have to do something like a CNAME to repoint it to the new one, or something like that. You don't want to rename a domain controller ever. And then you might also have to do an IP address, a secondary IP address. So those are some of the considerations. Again, it's something that if you haven't a lot of experience in, you might want to hire a consultant that's very experienced in this to guide you along that path. And one more bit of information. There was no domain enforced functional level upgrade for Windows Server 2019 and Windows Server 2022. It was 2016 for both 2019 and 2022. The functional levels only changed with 2025. Number 2, administrator roles and permissions. And this is really part of tightening down security and reducing risk. And I can't stress enough how often this is overlooked and just, quite frankly, abused. So what you'll want to do is review all the built-in roles for their current membership. So for instance, especially domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins, things such as DNS admins, DHCP admins, help desk administrators, Hyper-V administrators, all those kind of built-in roles that are in Active Directory in the built-in roles container. You always want to use the least permissions model for roles membership. Only give each user the membership they need to perform their daily duties and nothing more. Use the delegation of permissions wizard on OUs, so organizational units. So when you go to delegate permissions, you're going to go OU by OU and specify who has permissions on those OU, and you're going to get granular with it. If you haven't done that before, it's a very tricky process. There's literally hundreds of permissions, and that's something that you have to determine and discuss as to, read and write permissions and, propagation and all that kind of stuff. It's not just, hey, let's just throw up this wizard and figure it out as we're going along. And best practice dictates that you never assign a user directly through either one of those built-in roles or the delegation of permissions on OUs directly. You're going to use groups. For instance, you might have a help desk group. You might have a password reset group. You might have a administrator read-only permissions group. And then you're going to put members inside of there. And then you're going to use those groups for assignments, both as members of the role groups and when you're going through the permission wizard for the delegation of permissions. And lastly, disable all legacy accounts. So if you notice that a user has left the organization, then you're going to want to disable that account. Now, service accounts are a little tricky because what I've seen in the past is even though a service account is labeled for a very specific service, administrators have often reused that for another service. So be very careful with that. You're going to want to possibly disable that, be very vigilant on if there's any unknown or unexpected repercussions of that. And if there are, make a note of it and then check out which services were affected and then potentially change the service account to a dedicated service account, named dedicated service account for those services that were affected that weren't expected to use this service account. And ultimately, Microsoft model has grown to use group managed service accounts, GMSA, and henceforth we should be using, wherever possible, group managed service accounts, because it doesn't have the negative repercussions of password expiration, all that kind of stuff. The other thing with service accounts is that very often there will be a third-party application that has very specific permissions that need to be assigned for that service account. And to make it easy, some administrator had just given it domain admin permissions, which is a security risk. And service accounts, unless absolutely necessary and the vendor application absolutely requires domain admin permissions, I would recommend no service account should have domain admin or enterprise admin or schema admin's permission. Just read the vendor documentation and redo the permissions appropriately. Which brings us to number 1, poor management, poor oversight, poor decision making. Probably my biggest pet peeve, most annoying and most disruptive and hardest to deal with in a consulting role. And even as a direct hire, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen and experienced much frustration over this huge barrier and obstacle. Just because somebody's placed in a management position doesn't mean they're qualified, experienced, or receptive to the input of those that are underneath them. And ultimately, they just make bad decisions potentially that will affect everybody and the environment and productivity. So I'm just going to repost the mistakes and we'll talk about each one of them again. It's imperative that each organization has a change management system in place. And again, this needs to include decision makers in the organization in management. It needs to include the stakeholders for each team involved, for each technology that's involved. It needs to include vendors, if possible, and if it's something that they're engaged in. And there needs to be planning before any change management request is put into place. So the teams need to meet. They need to cross their T's and dot their I's on the technologies, look at all the prerequisites, look at a backup plan, plan it, and they need to document this very well to make sure that they've considered everything before making a change management request, as well as a backup plan, which is very important. There's not always a potential for a backup plan, but that needs to be included if there is no backup plan. It has to be scheduled, and there has to be a list of people that are on the notification list. There should also be accommodations for a bridge on the cutover period if there's a cutover, so that communications can be successfully happening back and forth in case we run into, issues. Regarding administrators performing projects outside of their scope and knowledge and experience, that's a risky one. I mean, you don't want to necessarily be the squeaky wheel. You don't want to be labeled as the person that complains about management. In my experience, it's best to just document it. It's not always best to go over your manager's head. It doesn't always turn out well, even with HR. In my experience, it just doesn't turn out well. My recommendation is to just say something politely and professionally, as far as a disagreement, and validate it in an email, why you disagree, and validate it technically, and leave it at that, and keep that documentation for your justification. Sorry, I skipped down to management making technical decisions and not trusting their experienced staff and contractors. So that's number 6 on the bolted list. So that's not number 2. So let's jump back to number 2. My apologies. Administrators performing projects outside of their scope and of knowledge and experience. Now, this typically happens with rookies. I think within the first few years of IT, amateurs don't understand the risks, and they want to learn everything, and that's great. But they just have to understand that there's a process to follow. There are procedures put in place as safeguards, and those all need to be followed, and they should not circumvent those. And those are put in place to minimize risk to production, for both downtime to production and security of data and breaches. And that's very important, as well as the learning process is not something that happens overnight. And sometimes people just need to stay in their swim lane. And us as IT specialists, we understand that we're not, we may be generalists in a lot of areas, but we have to understand where we're specialists and where we're not. And that actually covers the third bullet point, not knowing your limits as an administrator. And the next one is kind of a sore subject with me. No regular skills development training, especially if you're a salaried employee, full-time employee. You'll often be given the sales pitch when you get hired that, oh yes, we have development training in your figured into your weekly schedule, but you'll find that you're overloaded with your work schedule. They don't fund it, and they don't accommodate time for it. They say, oh, well, when you're on the bench, but either when you're on the bench, it's not funded, or they got internal tasks for you, or whatever. And this is just a bad management procedure. They don't plan for it properly. So it's something that HR and management needs to work on in the environment if it's not tackled appropriately. As I said in the mistakes part, the technology is constantly changing. You wouldn't ask your general practitioner physician to do brain surgery. You have to specialize, and even inside of a specialization, the technology is constantly changing and evolving. You need to keep up, and you need to constantly train and keep up with that technology. And that leads us to our next point. Not using contractor specialists when necessary. When you're a full-time employee and you're kind of a generalist or an administrator, or you're in a engineer 1, engineer 2, architect 1, architect 2, or enterprise architect role, or even in a practice lead role, there are some projects that really demand a specialist, and contractors who deal with this in and out every day, and who see these issues and how to deal with them, are best suited to consult with you. So a wise manager knows when their internal team can handle certain tasks or projects, and when they need to pull in consultants. And moving on, I know budgets are always a consideration. It's actually our duty to be assertive, to let upper management know that there's a risk if we take this project on internally and we don't have the experience or the expertise, that there's a huge risk. And that risk can come with production downtime, potential disasters, and ultimately increased expenditure if we try to do it ourselves and then we fail. And then somebody else has to come in who's more experienced, undo what we did, fix all the issues that happened as repercussions, and do it correctly. And that's the approach that you need to take with upper management. And in some projects, maybe you don't need contractors. It's fine. Basically, you just have to do your homework as best as possible. Do your research in pre-sales, talk to the consulting agency, talk to the engineers or architects in the consulting agency, assess the possible risks, look at the budget, potentially plan this for the next fiscal quarter or year, or ask for a budget increase. I know I ranted a lot on number one, but most often that is a root cause, the biggest risk and biggest obstacle to remediation and amelioration of the issues in the Active Directory environment, but generally speaking, all projects.
I sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch this video so far. I encourage you to like my video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell for future updates on videos. Feel free also to leave a comment. You can contribute by giving me a coffee through the link below. Patrons get exclusive access to some content. Members get access to all exclusive content, which includes things such as a ton of PowerShell scripts, troubleshooting articles, and how-to guides, etc. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.